When did you realize how dangerous men can be? I was watching my 7-year-old's hair when I noticed the bald patches littered across his scalp. It's nothing, Dad, he said, covering them with his hands. Coach says real swimmers don't need hair anyway. The thing was, Seymour has mild cerebral palsy, so I wanted to make sure he was okay. I called Coach Retisha the next morning. Hey, this is James, Seymour's dad. I wanted to ask about some training methods. Seymour has been losing hair and… Retisha chuckled. Oh boy, what's he telling you now? You know how these special needs kids are. Always making excuses, looking for sympathy. That stung. He mentioned something about underwater training. Listen, his tone hardened. I swam Division 3. I've coached 3 state champions. I know the difference between real potential and kids using their conditions as crutches. He paused. If Seymour can't handle standard training, maybe he belongs in the adaptive program with the other quitters. Well, it was easier to doubt myself than believe a coach would hurt my son. So I just hung up. But the bald patches spread. Quarter-sized, then larger. Seymour started vomiting before practice, claiming it was just nerves. When I suggested taking a break from swimming, he panicked. No! Coach says I'm almost there, almost a real swimmer. At pickup on Friday, another dad pulled me aside. My kid says Retisha has been doing special sessions with certain swimmers, keeps them after practice. She saw him holding Seymour underwater with a stopwatch. The following Thursday, I got the call. Seymour had been pulled unconscious from the pool. By the time I reached the hospital, he was awake but on oxygen, his scalp visible through widening bald patches. The ER doctor pulled me aside, her expression grave. Mr. Crest, when we examined Seymour, we found water in his lungs. This isn't from today. There's evidence of repeated aspiration. Has he mentioned any unusual training? My stomach dropped. He takes swimming seriously. His cortisol levels are dangerously high. The hair loss is stress-induced alopecia. This child is experiencing severe chronic trauma. She studied my face. I was about to answer when Seymour, who I thought was sleeping, spoke up. Coach Retisha says different bodies need different limits. The room went silent. What do you mean? The social worker asked gently. Seymour's eyes stayed closed. Regular swimmers hold their breath for 30 seconds, but I have to do 2 minutes, sometimes more. Coach says my body needs to work harder because it's broken. My hands started shaking. Seymour, does Coach let you come up when you need air? No. He holds my shoulders down, says the fear will fix my brain, make the palsy go away. He times it. His voice was small. 2 minutes 37 seconds is my record. That's when everything went black today. The social worker was typing furiously. Seymour, how long has this been happening? Since September. Coach says by June I'll either be cured or I'll quit. Real swimmers get cured. I called the other parents that night. Their kids confirmed it. Retisha had been joking about drowning the weakness out, but everyone thought it was just tough coaching. They didn't know he was actually doing it to the kids he deemed defective. I went to the principal the next morning with everything. She sighed deeply. Coach Retisha has produced 12 state qualifiers. He's unconventional, yes, but results speak for themselves. Seymour is probably misunderstanding the training. He's deliberately drowning my son. Has he ever prevented Seymour from surfacing when truly in distress? Children often exaggerate when they find sports challenging. Maybe Seymour needs a program more suited to his limitations? The threat was clear. Push this, and they'd ban Seymour from regular swimming forever. With that on his record, no team would take him. I tried the police. The officer shrugged. Tough coaching isn't illegal. Did he physically harm your son? No? Then find a new swim program. The next afternoon, I watched practice from the viewing area. The other kids did normal drills while Seymour was pulled aside. Retisha held him underwater, checking his stopwatch. I counted 45 seconds, a minute, 90 seconds. Seymour's body started thrashing. 2 minutes. Only then did Retisha let him surface, gasping. That night, Seymour had a seizure. Back to the hospital. The neurologist was blunt. One more incident and he could have permanent brain damage. The repeated oxygen deprivation is causing neural inflammation. His coaches then remove him from the team. I just smiled, because all I needed was for Retisha to understand what drowning felt like, and I knew exactly who could teach him. I called my brother Ray, who did 4 years for aggravated assault. Remember when we were kids and Dad threw us in the quarry? Told us to swim or die? Yeah, this coach has been drowning Seymour. For months. Silence. Then, coaches stay late to clean the pool area, right? Alone? 3 days later, Ray showed up with rope and a weighted belt. For demonstration purposes, he said, people learn better through experience. Just remember, Ray said as we walked toward the aquatic center, he needs to experience every second Seymour did. We're teachers now, too. The parking lot was empty except for 3 cars near the back entrance, and my legs felt heavy as we crossed the asphalt. Ray's gym bag hung from his shoulder, the weighted belt and rope inside making a dull clinking sound with each step. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, so loud I was sure Ray could hear it too. My phone buzzed and I checked it quickly. Hans's text confirming that Coach would be alone in his office until 9 doing paperwork. We had 2 hours before the night security sweep started. The aquatic center looked different at night. Darker somehow, with only a few lights on near the entrance. Ray touched my arm and nodded toward the back door, and we moved faster now, staying close to the building. The door was propped open with a small wedge, just like Hans promised. We slipped inside, and the smell of chlorine hit me so hard I almost gagged, my throat closing up. All I could think about was Seymour thrashing underwater while this man checked his stopwatch, counting seconds while my son's brain screamed for air. Ray's hand landed on my shoulder and squeezed. He leaned close and whispered that we stick to the plan, get the admission on camera, then get out before anyone gets seriously hurt. I nodded, but my hands were shaking. The hallway was quiet except for the hum of the pool filters, and we moved toward the equipment room where Hans said he'd be waiting. He was there, leaning against a storage locker, and his hands were shaking worse than mine. He showed us where he positioned 3 small cameras with clear views of the pool deck and shallow end, pointing to each one and explaining the angles. His voice was too loud and I had to tell him to keep it down. He explained the silent alarm button behind the lifeguard stand, how it would bring police in under 5 minutes. Then he made me promise again that we were just scaring Coach into confessing, not actually drowning him. I looked him in the eye and lied, saying of course that's all this is, just a scare tactic. Hans looked relieved, but I could see doubt in his face. We heard footsteps in the hallway and all 3 of us froze, barely breathing. It was just Hans doing his normal rounds, the sound echoing off the tile walls. Through the window, I could see Coach at his desk in the office, reviewing what looked like practice schedules, a coffee cup next to his elbow. Ray pulled out the rope from his bag and tested the knots, tugging hard to make sure they'd hold. I watched him work and tried to remember why we thought this was a good idea, instead of just letting the system handle it. The system already failed, I reminded myself, thinking about the principal's threat to exile Seymour to the adaptive program forever. I thought about the police officer who shrugged and called attempted murder tough coaching. Ray looked at me and nodded toward the office, asking quietly if I was ready. I realized there was no version of tonight where I didn't become someone different from I was this morning, someone who breaks into buildings and threatens people. We waited in the equipment room, watching through the small window. Coach stood up and stretched, then walked toward the pool deck carrying a testing kit. Ray moved first, fast and quiet like he'd done this before, circling around through the locker room to come up behind him. I went the other way, stepping onto the pool deck from the main entrance. Coach saw me and his whole face changed, going hard and angry. He asked what the hell I was doing here after hours, his voice sharp. I told him we needed to talk about what he did to my son. He laughed, and said Seymour quit because he couldn't handle real training. He said kids with disabilities always make excuses, always looking for sympathy instead of pushing through. Ray stepped out of the shadows behind him and Coach spun around. His confidence cracked when he saw Ray's size and the look on his face. He started backing up toward the pool edge, his testing kit forgotten on the deck. Ray told him to sit down and Coach refused, puffing up his chest and saying he was calling security. His hand was shaking when he reached for his phone in his pocket. I knocked it out of his grip before he could dial, and it skittered across the wet tiles and splashed into the pool. Coach's eyes went wide as he watched it sink, and I could see him realizing that no one was coming to save him. We made him sit at the shallow end, his legs dangling over the edge. I pulled out Seymour's notebook from my jacket, the one where he logged all his underwater times. I started reading them out loud while Coach kept saying I was misunderstanding the training methodology, that I didn't understand competitive swimming. When I got to the last entry, 2 minutes, 37 seconds, and everything went black, my voice cracked. Ray grabbed Coach's shoulder and asked how that was training instead of torture. Coach tried to stand up and Ray pushed him back down, not rough but firm, just enough pressure to keep him seated. I could see Coach starting to panic the way Seymour must have panicked, his breathing getting faster. I told him we were going to help him understand what my son experienced. Ray pulled out the weighted belt from the bag, and Coach's face went white. He started talking fast, saying he never meant to hurt anyone, that it was all a misunderstanding. Ray pulls the weighted belt from his bag and moves behind Coach, who's still sitting at the pool edge with his feet dangling in the water. Coach tries to stand, but Ray puts a hand on his shoulder and holds him down, not rough but firm enough that Coach understands he's not going anywhere. Ray wraps the belt around Coach's waist and starts fastening the buckle, and that's when Coach really starts talking, words coming fast like he thinks if he explains enough, we'll understand. He says he was trying to push past mental blocks, that fear is what keeps disabled kids from reaching their potential, that if he could just break through that barrier, Seymour would be stronger. I watch him talk and feel my hands shaking because he actually believes this. I ask him if Seymour reaching his potential was worth giving him seizures, worth the permanent trauma the neurologist warned about, worth my son losing patches of hair from stress. Coach goes quiet then, his mouth still open like he wants to keep explaining but suddenly has no words left. Ray finishes with the belt and tugs it to make sure it's secure, and Coach looks down at it like he's only now understanding what we're doing here. We tell him to get in the pool and Coach looks between us, calculating something in his head. He's a big guy, used to being the authority, and I can see him trying to figure out if he can fight his way past both of us. Ray must see it too because he steps closer, blocking the path to the exit, and Coach's shoulders slump. He slides into the shallow end, the water only coming up to his waist, and the weighted belt pulls at him even in the shallow water. Ray tells him to take a deep breath, and Coach's whole face goes white. He starts begging then, saying he'll admit everything, he'll resign, he'll do whatever we want. Just please don't do this. His voice cracks on the last word, and I think about Seymour's voice cracking when he told the social worker about the 2 minutes 37 seconds. I think about my son thrashing underwater while this man checked his stopwatch, and I feel nothing when Coach begs. I point to the spots where Hans positioned the cameras, 3 different angles covering the pool deck and shallow end. I tell Coach to admit it to the cameras then, and his head whips around looking for escape routes, looking for someone to help him. He starts talking again, but different now, using official language about established training protocols for adaptive athletes, saying the underwater work was about building mental toughness. Ray cuts him off and tells him to stop lying, or we'll show him exactly what Seymour felt, and Ray's hand moves to Coach's shoulder like he's ready to push him under. Coach's eyes go wide and he holds up his hands, and I can smell the chlorine mixed with his fear sweat. That's when Coach breaks completely. Words start tumbling out about how he genuinely believed the stress would rewire Seymour's brain, that he'd read studies about neuroplasticity and extreme conditioning. He admits holding Seymour down past the point of panic, admits ignoring the thrashing, admits thinking the seizure was just Seymour being dramatic instead of a medical emergency. He's talking to the cameras now, not to us, like he's trying to explain to some future audience why he did what he did. I feel Ray tense beside me, and I know my brother is hearing every word, cataloging every admission. Coach says he thought if he could just push hard enough, Seymour's brain would adapt, the palsy would improve, and he'd become a real swimmer. The way he says real swimmer makes my stomach turn because I hear what he really means, that kids like Seymour aren't real unless they're fixed. I ask about the other kids, and Coach hesitates, his eyes darting away from the camera. Then he admits there were 3 others over the past 2 years, other kids with disabilities he put through what he calls enhanced protocols. He's crying now, tears mixing with pool water on his face, saying he thought he was helping them. He tells us his own coach used similar methods when he was young, and it made him a Division III swimmer. Like that justifies everything. I realize he actually believes this insane logic, that he's convinced himself torture equals training. He keeps saying he wanted to prove disabled kids could be champions, that he was trying to give them opportunities, and I want to ask him if opportunities usually involve holding children underwater until they seize. Ray asks if his coach held him underwater until he seized, and Coach goes completely quiet. I watch his face and see the exact moment he understands something he's never let himself see before, that what was done to him was abuse that he then passed on to kids like Seymour. He starts sobbing, saying he never meant to hurt anyone, that he just wanted to help these kids reach their potential. Ray looks at me and I can see him asking permission with his eyes, asking if he should dunk Coach anyway, show him what it really feels like. Part of me wants to say yes, wants Coach to experience that panic and helplessness, but I'm about to tell Ray to stand down when I hear something. The sound comes from across the pool deck, near the lifeguard stand where Hans is positioned. It's a quiet alarm, barely audible, but I know what it means. Seconds later, I hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. Coach hears them too and tries to bolt, scrambling toward the pool edge, but Ray grabs the weighted belt and holds him in place. Coach thrashes in the waist-deep water, trying to pull free, but Ray is stronger and the belt weighs him down. I tell Coach he's going to repeat everything he just said when the police arrive, every single admission. The sirens get louder and I can see red and blue lights starting to flash through the windows. The main doors burst open and police flood in, at least 4 officers with Hans leading them. They find Ray holding Coach in the shallow end by the belt, while I stand on the deck with Seymour's notebook still in my hand. The officers start shouting orders, telling Ray to let go and step away from the pool, hands where they can see them. We both comply immediately, Ray releasing the belt and raising his hands, me setting down the notebook and doing the same. Coach scrambles out of the water, still wearing the weighted belt, water streaming off him as he points at us and starts talking frantically. One officer helps Coach while another 2 approach us, and a 4th officer starts looking around the pool deck. I see him spot the rope and bag we brought, and he calls over another officer who starts taking photos. Hans gives his statement to the first officer on scene, explaining he heard a disturbance and called for help. He's careful not to mention letting us in or positioning the cameras, playing his role perfectly as the concerned assistant manager who just happened to be doing his rounds. The officers separate us for questioning, putting Ray near the equipment room, me by the viewing area, and Coach in the office. I can see Coach talking frantically to one officer, his hands gesturing wildly, probably claiming we assaulted him and tried to drown him. Another officer bags the rope and weighted belt as evidence, sealing them in plastic bags and labeling them carefully. A 3rd officer is photographing everything, the pool deck, the shallow end, even Seymour's notebook that I set down. They take us to the station in separate cars. Ray goes in one patrol car, I go in another, and I watch through the window as they load Coach into a 3rd car, still wet and shaking. At the station, they put Ray and me in different interrogation rooms, small windowless spaces with metal tables and uncomfortable chairs. I spend 3 hours repeating the same story to a detective who looks tired and skeptical. I tell him about confronting the coach who tortured my son, about the months of abuse, about the system that protected the abuser instead of the victim. The detective asks why I didn't let the system handle it, and I tell him I tried the system. I went to the principal who threatened to exile Seymour from regular swimming. I went to the police who shrugged it off as tough coaching. I watched my son have a seizure while everyone told me I was overreacting. The detective writes everything down, but his expression doesn't change, and I know how this looks. 2 men with rope and a weighted belt confronting someone at night. I can hear Ray's voice through the wall between interrogation rooms, louder than mine, and I'm terrified he's going to take full blame to protect me. The detective slides 3 photos across the metal table, showing the weighted belt, the coiled rope, and a wide shot of both items laid out on the pool deck. He taps the belt photo with his pen and asks what exactly we plan to do with these items. I tell him we wanted to scare Coach into admitting what he did to my son, make him understand how it felt, get a confession on camera. The detective writes that down and asks if we plan to actually drown him. I say no, just scare him enough to tell the truth, but I can hear how weak that sounds even as I'm saying it. He asks why I didn't just report the abuse through proper channels, and I feel my jaw clench. I tell him I tried proper channels, went to the principal who threatened to ban Seymour from regular swimming, went to police who said tough coaching isn't illegal, watched my son have a seizure while everyone told me I was overreacting. The detective's expression doesn't change, and he asks if I understand that taking the law into my own hands is also illegal. I tell him apparently it's illegal to protect your kid, but perfectly legal to hold him underwater until he seizes. He closes his notebook and says someone will be back to process the charges. I sit alone in that little room for another hour, listening to Ray's voice through the wall getting louder, and I know he's trying to make it sound like this was all his idea. A different officer finally comes in and tells me they're charging both of us with trespassing, assault, and unlawful restraint. He reads me my rights again, even though I was already read them at the pool, and I'm trying to figure out how bail works when I hear a familiar voice in the hallway. Baker walks into the room looking tired and disappointed, his tie loose and shirt wrinkled like he got dressed in a hurry. He tells the officer he's representing both defendants and asks about bail. The officer says the detective is recommending we be released on our own recognizance given our ties to the community and the fact that the victim isn't seriously injured. Baker nods and says he'll guarantee we appear for arraignment. 20 minutes later, Ray and I are walking out of the station into the parking lot where Baker's car is waiting. The sun is starting to come up and I realize we've been in there for over 4 hours. Baker unlocks the car and we climb in, Ray in front and me in back, and nobody says anything for the first few minutes. Baker finally breaks the silence and asks what the hell we were thinking. Ray turns to look at him and says, "We were thinking about a 7-year-old who can't sleep without nightmares, who lost patches of hair from stress, who seized because some coach thought drowning would cure his disability." Baker is quiet for a minute while he drives and then says he understands, but that doesn't make it legal. He says we've given Coach's lawyers ammunition to claim he's the victim now, that any criminal case against him just got a lot harder because his defense can argue the confession was coerced under duress. Ray asks if Baker would have done anything different if it was his kid, and Baker doesn't answer. He drops Ray off at his apartment first and then drives me home. Before I get out, he warns me that CPS will be notified immediately because my arrest triggered an automatic safety check. He says I need to be prepared for them to question whether Seymour is safe with me, and I feel sick because I tried to protect my son, and now the system might take him away. I walk up to my front door and it opens before I can get my keys out. My neighbor is standing there with her finger to her lips. She whispers that Seymour woke up from a nightmare around midnight and couldn't get back to sleep, so she came over to sit with him. I thank her and she squeezes my arm before leaving. Seymour is curled up on the couch with a blanket, and when he sees me, his face crumples. He asks if I'm okay, and I realize my son is trying to comfort me when it should be the other way around. I sit down next to him and pull him close and tell him everything's going to be fine, even though I have no idea if that's true. He falls asleep against my shoulder, and I don't move for the next 2 hours. The doorbell rings at 8 in the morning, and I know who it is before I open the door. A woman in her 40s with a briefcase introduces herself as Karina from CPS and says she needs to do an emergency home visit. Her expression is serious but not unkind as she explains that my arrest triggered an automatic safety check. I let her in, and she asks to speak with Seymour. He's eating cereal at the kitchen table and looks confused when she sits down across from him. She asks if he feels safe with me, and he says yes immediately without hesitation. She asks if I've ever used violence at home, and he looks even more confused and says no, that I've never hit him or hurt him or anything like that. She writes everything down and asks him a few more questions about his daily routine, school, friends. After 20 minutes, she asks to speak with me privately. We go into the hallway and she tells me the arrest complicates everything. She says even though I was trying to protect Seymour, I showed poor judgment and potential for violence. She's putting a safety plan in place that requires parenting classes, anger management, and supervised visits if I'm charged with anything more serious than what I already face. I feel the system punishing me for its own failures, making me jump through hoops because I tried to stop the abuse they ignored. She hands me paperwork about the classes and leaves. That afternoon, my phone rings and it's Meg. She sounds excited when she tells me her editor finally approved the story after Coach's partial confession was caught on Hans's cameras. The audio isn't perfect, but you can clearly hear him saying he held kids underwater and believed it would cure their disabilities. She's running it in tomorrow's paper with quotes from the ER doctor about Seymour's repeated aspiration and trauma. I thank her and hang up feeling like maybe something good will finally come from all this. The story comes out the next morning with the headline, "Local swim coach admits to enhanced protocols for disabled children." My phone starts ringing before I even finish reading the article. 3 other parents call within an hour. The first dad says his son went through similar treatment, but he thought it was just tough competitive coaching. The second mom is crying, so hard I can barely understand her. She says she pulled her daughter from the team last year because of attitude problems, and now she realizes those were probably trauma responses. The third parent asks if there's going to be a lawsuit, because his kid has been in therapy for anxiety, and he never connected it to swimming. By noon, my voicemail is full. The school district issues a statement around 2 in the afternoon. I read it on their website, and it says they're placing Coach on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. It sounds good until I turn on the local news and see the union rep being interviewed. He's calling it a rush to judgment based on a coerced confession. He suggests that Seymour's medical issues might be pre-existing and unrelated to swimming. I want to throw my TV through the window, but Seymour is sitting next to me, so I just turn it off. Baker calls that evening and says he filed a formal complaint with the State Coaching Association. He included Seymour's medical records, the notebook with all the logged times and statements from the other parents who called. The association responds within 3 days, saying they're suspending Coach's certification pending their own investigation. Baker sounds satisfied when he tells me this and says it's the first institutional response that actually takes the abuse seriously instead of protecting the abuser. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in a courtroom that smells like floor polish and stress, waiting for my arraignment. The prosecutor is a woman in her 40s who looks tired and offers me a deal without much preamble. She says if I plead guilty to misdemeanor trespassing and assault, accept probation and community service, they'll drop the unlawful restraint charge. Baker leans over and whispers that I should take it because a trial could go badly. He says juries don't like vigilante justice no matter how good the reason, and if I get convicted on all charges, I could face jail time that would destroy Seymour. I look at Ray sitting 3 rows back and he gives me a small nod. The prosecutor is waiting for my answer, so I tell her I'll take the deal. She marks something on her paperwork and says Ray's case will be handled separately because of his record. That makes my stomach drop because I know what that means. After the hearing, Ray and I stand in the courthouse hallway, and he tells me his lawyer got him an offer too. He says it includes possible jail time even with a plea, and I feel sick because he was only there to help me. I start to apologize, but Ray cuts me off and says he'd do it again. He says some things matter more than staying out of trouble, and he looks me straight in the eye when he says it. I hug my brother for the first time in years, and he hugs me back hard. My sentencing happens 3 days later, and the judge is an older woman who looks at me like she's trying to figure something out. She sentences me to 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management classes. Then she tells me she understands my motivation, but that vigilante justice undermines the legal system. I nod respectfully and say I understand, but I'm thinking the legal system already failed my son, so what exactly was I supposed to trust? The judge accepts my plea and dismisses me, and I walk out feeling like I got off easy compared to what could have happened. Ray's sentencing is the following week, and I'm there in the courtroom when the judge gives him 6 months in county jail because of his priors. Ray doesn't react, just nods when the judge asks if he understands the sentence. I visit him every week after that, driving to the county facility and sitting across from him in the visiting room with the plastic chairs and vending machines. Ray tells me to stop apologizing every single time, says he's been in worse places and the only thing he wants to know is how Seymour is doing. I tell him about therapy and school and swimming, and Ray listens like it's the most important information in the world. Meanwhile, the district attorney opens a criminal investigation into Coach based on the new victim statements and medical evidence from all the families who came forward. A different prosecutor calls me in for an interview, a younger woman who seems actually interested in what happened. She's professional but sympathetic when she asks me to describe what Seymour experienced. I walk her through the underwater holds, the seizure, the hospital visits, the neurologist's warnings. She takes notes the whole time and explains that child endangerment cases are hard to prove, but they're building a strong case with multiple victims. I ask what that means for Coach, and she says they're gathering evidence for formal charges. Seymour starts therapy with a counselor who works with kids who've been through bad stuff, and the first few sessions are brutal. I wait in the lobby while they talk, and when Seymour comes out, his eyes are red. The therapist tells me later that he keeps blaming himself for not being strong enough, for not handling the training better. She says it's normal for abuse victims to internalize responsibility. Over the next week, she works on helping him understand that adults are supposed to keep kids safe, not the other way around. Seymour slowly starts to believe it, asking fewer questions about whether he disappointed Coach and more questions about why Coach thought hurting him was okay. 3 months after the confrontation at the pool, Baker calls to say the prosecutor offered Coach a plea deal. The deal is 4 counts of child endangerment, a suspended sentence with 5 years probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent ban from coaching minors. Baker says Coach's lawyer tried to negotiate for less, but the prosecutor told him to take it or face trial with more victims ready to testify. I ask when we'll know if he takes it, and Baker says probably within a week. 5 days later, Baker calls again and says Coach took the plea. I'm in the courtroom when Coach stands up to allocute, admitting in flat legal language that he used training methods that endangered the health and safety of minor athletes in his care. He doesn't look at me or any of the other parents. His voice is steady and empty, like he's reading a grocery list. It's not the full confession I wanted, not him saying he held kids underwater until they seized, but watching him accept responsibility in front of a judge feels like something. The prosecutor tells me the sentencing hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks later and asks if I want to give a victim impact statement on Seymour's behalf. I say yes immediately. I spend the next 2 weeks writing and rewriting the statement, trying to explain what it's like to watch your child's hair fall out from stress while adults tell you you're overreacting. I write about the seizure and the bald patches and the nightmares that still wake Seymour up. I write about the neurologist's warning that one more incident could cause permanent brain damage. I read it out loud to myself over and over until the words feel right. At the sentencing hearing, I stand at the podium and read my statement while Coach sits at the defense table. I describe finding the bald patches and calling the hospital and counting the seconds while Coach held Seymour under. I describe my son's voice saying the fear was supposed to fix his brain. Coach won't look at me the entire time. 2 other parents read statements after me, talking about their kids' anxiety and trauma and therapy bills. One dad's voice breaks when he describes his daughter's nightmares about drowning. The judge listens to all of it, and her expression gets harder with each statement. When the last parent finishes, the judge looks at Coach for a long moment before she starts talking about his sentence. The judge looks directly at Coach, and her voice gets cold as she tells him she's sentencing him to the maximum allowed under the plea agreement. 5 years probation with strict conditions, including staying away from all youth sports facilities and registering with the state's child abuse registry. She says his belief that he was helping these children makes his actions more disturbing, not less, because it shows a complete lack of understanding about the harm he caused. I feel something small but solid click into place in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that someone in authority finally sees what he did. Coach keeps his head down and doesn't look at anyone as the bailiff explains the registry requirements and probation conditions. Outside the courthouse, Baker tells me he's filing a civil lawsuit against the school district today for negligent supervision and failure to protect students. He's naming the principal specifically for her dismissive response when I reported the abuse. I ask if we have a real case, and Baker says the district's own policies required them to investigate, and they chose to protect the coach instead. Within a week, the district's insurance company reaches out asking about settlement, which Baker says means they know they're liable and want to avoid a public trial. The settlement negotiations drag on for 2 months with lawyers exchanging offers and counteroffers while I try to focus on Seymour's therapy and my probation requirements. Baker calls every few days with updates about their latest offer, and eventually they reach $200,000 to cover Seymour's medical expenses, therapy, and future educational needs. Baker says we could push for more at trial, but the certainty and speed of settlement means Seymour gets help now, instead of years from now when a trial finally ends. I think about it for a day and tell Baker I'll accept if they agree to implement new safety protocols. I want mandatory reporting training for all coaches and administrators, plus independent oversight of adaptive athletics programs. The district agrees within 48 hours, and I sign the settlement papers in Baker's office. The money goes into a trust fund for Seymour, and I feel like maybe other kids will be safer, even though it can't undo what happened to my son. 6 months after the confrontation, I finish my parenting classes and complete my probation check-ins without any problems. Karina from CPS shows up for a final home visit and tells me she's closing our case. She says privately that she's seen way worse parents than someone who went too far protecting their kid. The relief of not having CPS supervision hanging over us feels enormous, like I can finally breathe normally instead of constantly worrying they'll take Seymour away. That same week, Seymour asks about swimming again, not with a team but just for fun. I'm terrified, but his therapist says reclaiming positive experiences with water could be healing for him. We spend 2 weeks researching programs and find a therapeutic recreation center with a gentle instructor who works with kids recovering from trauma. The instructor's name is Marie, and she meets with us before the first session to understand what Seymour went through. She promises they'll go at his pace with no pressure, and Seymour agrees to try 1 session. The first session is hard, and Seymour panics when Marie asks him to put his face in the water. His whole body goes stiff, and he backs away from her toward the pool edge. Marie stays calm and patient and tells him they can just play in the shallow end today. They spend the whole hour playing with foam noodles and floating toys without going underwater once. Seymour comes out exhausted, but tells me he wants to try again next week. I'm so proud of his courage I almost cry in the parking lot, but hold it together until we get home. 4 months after his sentencing, Ray gets released from county jail with good behavior credit. Seymour and I are waiting at the jail entrance when Ray walks out carrying his property bag. Seymour runs to him and Ray picks him up and spins him around while Seymour laughs. Seymour tells Ray he's his hero, and Ray looks at me over Seymour's head with an expression I can't quite read, something between pride and sadness. Later that night, after Seymour goes to bed, Ray and I talk about whether we'd do it differently. Ray says no because the system wasn't going to save Seymour, and someone had to act. I say maybe yes because we almost made things worse and could have lost everything. We agree to disagree, and Ray says the only thing that matters is Seymour is safe now. I realize my brother understands love and protection better than I ever gave him credit for, even if his methods are questionable. 6 months after everything started, Meg Wright calls to say she's doing a follow-up story about the policy changes and the other victims who came forward. She wants to interview me about the whole experience, and I agree to meet her at a coffee shop downtown. I talk about how broken the system is when parents have to choose between trusting institutions that fail their kids or taking dangerous action themselves. Meg asks good questions about what needs to change, and I tell her about mandatory reporting requirements and independent oversight. The story runs the following Sunday with quotes from me and 2 other parents, plus details about the new district policies. The story sparks conversations in the comments section and on local parent forums about youth sports accountability and how to protect kids from abusive coaches. 2 months later, I get an email from a state representative asking if I'd be willing to testify about a new bill requiring background checks and abuse prevention training for all youth sports coaches. The bill was inspired partly by Seymour's case and other similar incidents that came to light after the news coverage. I agree immediately because if my family's nightmare can prevent even one other kid from going through what Seymour did, then maybe it means something. The committee hearing is on a Tuesday morning at the state capitol, and I take the day off work to drive there. The hearing room is smaller than I expected, with maybe 30 people scattered across the gallery and a panel of legislators sitting behind a long table at the front. When my turn comes, I walk to the microphone and tell them about finding the bald patches, about the hospital visits, about the seizure that almost caused permanent brain damage. I explain how the principal protected the coach and how the police dismissed my concerns as tough coaching. Some of the legislators take notes while others just watch me with serious expressions. When I finish, one representative asks what would have helped earlier in the process, and I tell her mandatory reporting requirements and independent oversight, so parents don't have to choose between trusting broken systems or taking dangerous action themselves. Another legislator asks if I think the bill goes far enough, and I say honestly no, but it's better than nothing and it might save some kids. The hearing lasts 3 hours with testimony from other parents, coaching experts, and child safety advocates. The bill passes out of committee 2 weeks later, and I feel like maybe something good can come from all this pain. Around the same time, Seymour's hair starts growing back in the spots where it fell out. At first, it's just thin peach fuzz, barely visible unless you look close, but gradually it thickens into real hair. Seymour checks his scalp in the mirror every morning and gets excited about each new patch of growth. His therapist tells me during one of our check-in sessions that the physical healing mirrors his emotional healing. Seymour still has nightmares sometimes where he's trapped underwater and can't breathe, but they're less frequent now, maybe once or twice a month instead of every night. The therapist taught him breathing exercises to calm himself down when he wakes up scared, and most nights he can use them successfully without needing me to come sit with him. I ask if she thinks he'll ever fully recover, and she says trauma doesn't work like that. It becomes part of who you are, but Seymour is learning healthy ways to carry it. She says he's one of the most resilient kids she's worked with, and I feel proud and sad at the same time because no 7-year-old should have to be this resilient. One afternoon, I get a call from another parent whose daughter was also abused by Coach. She says several families have been talking, and they want to start a support group for parents whose kids experienced coaching abuse. We schedule our first meeting at a community center conference room, and 6 families show up. We sit in a circle and take turns sharing our stories, and it's hard but also helpful to talk to people who understand. One dad breaks down crying about how he was ignored the warning signs because he trusted the coach's reputation. A mother talks about her rage at the school administrators who protected the abuser instead of the children. We all struggle with the guilt of not recognizing the abuse sooner and the anger at systems that failed our kids. By the end of the first meeting, we agree to keep meeting monthly because talking to people who get it helps more than talking to people who don't. Over the next few months, the group becomes an important part of my healing process. We share resources about therapists and lawyers, we vent about the frustrating legal system, and slowly we're all healing together, even though the scars never fully disappear. My community service requirement from the plea deal is 200 hours, and I decide to complete them at a child advocacy center that helps families navigate CPS and legal systems. Baker says it's good optics for my probation officer, but honestly it feels meaningful to use what I learned to help other families. I spend Saturday mornings at the center talking to parents who are dealing with abuse allegations or custody issues or similar situations where the system seems designed to make things harder instead of easier. I help them understand the paperwork, explain what to expect at hearings, and connect them with resources. One single mom tells me I'm the first person who actually explained things in a way she could understand instead of using legal jargon. Another dad thanks me for helping him realize he's not crazy for not trusting the authorities who dismissed his concerns. By the time I finish my 200 hours, I've helped maybe 30 families, and several of them stay in touch to update me on their cases. It doesn't erase what I did at the pool that night, but it feels like I'm channeling that protective instinct into something constructive instead of destructive. The school year ends in early June, and Seymour's teacher asks to meet with me on the last day. I walk into her classroom expecting bad news, but she smiles and tells me Seymour is doing really well. She says he's making friends and participating in class discussions and turning in his homework on time. His anxiety levels are way down compared to last fall when he was constantly sick and distracted. She doesn't know the full story about what happened with the swim team, but she knows something was wrong before and is better now. She tells me Seymour is a sweet kid with a good heart, and she's glad to see him happy again. Her quiet support means more than she probably realizes because so many adults failed Seymour last year. Having a teacher who notices when he's struggling and celebrates when he's thriving reminds me that not all institutions are broken, just some of the people running them. The coaching association sends me a formal letter in July stating they've completed their investigation and permanently revoked coaches' certification. The letter includes details about new policies they're implementing regarding adaptive athlete training. The policies specifically prohibit extended breath-holding exercises, underwater restraint, and any training methods that cause physical distress beyond normal athletic exertion. Coaches working with disabled athletes now need additional certification in adaptive sports methodology and regular supervision. The association also establishes a confidential reporting system where athletes can report concerning coaching behavior without fear of retaliation. None of these changes bring back what Seymour lost or erase his trauma, but they might protect future kids from going through the same thing. I file the letter in the folder with all the other documentation from this nightmare because someday Seymour might want to see that his suffering led to real changes. Ray calls me in August to say he got a job at a construction company whose owner specifically hires people with criminal records. The owner believes in second chances and gives ex-cons opportunities to prove themselves. Ray sounds proud when he tells me about it and says he's been showing up on time every day and staying out of trouble. He asks if he can come over for dinner that week, and I say, of course, you're always welcome. Ray starts coming over every Wednesday night, and Seymour lights up when he arrives. They play video games together, and Ray helps Seymour with his math homework and tells him stories about the construction projects he's working on. Watching them together, I realize how grateful I am that my son has another adult in his life who would do anything to protect him. Ray made mistakes and paid for them, but his love for Seymour never wavered. Family is complicated and messy, but it's also the people who show up when things get hard. A year after the confrontation at the pool, my probation officer schedules a review meeting. She tells me I've had perfect compliance with all probation requirements, completed my community service hours, attended every anger management class, and shown genuine remorse and rehabilitation. She says she's recommending early termination of my probation to the judge based on my record. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks later, and I dress in a suit and show up 30 minutes early. The judge reviews my file and asks me a few questions about what I've learned and how I've changed. I tell her honestly that I learned the system is broken, but that doesn't give me the right to break it further, that I should have kept fighting through proper channels, even when it felt hopeless. She grants the early termination, and I walk out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I have in months. Maybe I can finally move forward instead of constantly looking back at my mistakes. Seymour continues with his therapeutic swimming sessions, and after several months, his instructor tells me he's ready to try a recreational league if he wants. She emphasizes it would be low pressure and fun-focused, not competitive. I ask Seymour what he thinks, and he gets quiet for a minute before saying he wants to try. My stomach drops because the idea of him going back to swimming terrifies me, but I won't let my fear steal something he loves. I sign him up for a recreational league at a different community center with completely different coaches and a reputation for being supportive rather than intense. The first practice is in September, and I stay in the viewing area the whole time watching like a hawk. The new swim program is everything the old one wasn't. The coaches focus on proper technique and personal improvement instead of winning. They set reasonable goals and celebrate effort as much as achievement. Kids laugh and splash and play games between drills instead of being pushed past their limits. Seymour makes friends with another boy who also has cerebral palsy, and they practice together and cheer each other on. After the first few sessions, Seymour tells me swimming is fun again, and I realize this is what youth sports should have been all along. Not about producing champions or proving anything, but about kids enjoying movement and building confidence and making friends. Watching Seymour dive into the pool without fear, watching him surface with a smile instead of gasping for air, I finally believe that maybe we're going to be okay. A few weeks after Seymour's first successful swim session, an envelope arrives from a law office I don't recognize. Inside is a formal letter from Retisha's probation officer explaining that as part of his probation requirements, he wants to write an apology letter to our family. The letter asks if I'm willing to accept it, noting that I have every right to refuse and it won't affect his probation status either way. I put the letter on the kitchen counter and stare at it for 3 days, picking it up and putting it down, unsure what I want. Part of me wants to throw it away and never think about that man again, But another part wonders if Seymour might want to read it someday when he's older and trying to make sense of what happened to him. I talked to Seymour's therapist about it during my own session. She suggested I come in occasionally to process everything. And she says acceptance doesn't mean forgiveness. It just means being willing to hear what he has to say. After a week of thinking, I send a short email back saying yes, he can send the letter. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrives with Retisha's return address on it. I wait until Seymour is at a friend's house before I open it, not wanting him to see my reaction if it's awful. The letter is 4 pages long, handwritten in careful block letters. He starts by taking full responsibility for what he did, no excuses or justifications, just a flat statement that he hurt children under his care and that nothing makes that okay. Then he writes about his own coach when he was young, a man who used similar methods and told him the pain would make him stronger. He never questioned it because he made Division III, so he thought it worked, thought that's just what tough coaching looked like. He writes that he never processed his own trauma, never understood that what happened to him was abuse, so he just replicated it thinking he was helping kids the way his coach helped him. The letter goes on to describe the therapy he's doing now, learning about trauma and how abuse gets passed down when people don't deal with their own pain. He says he's starting to understand the harm he caused, not just physically, but emotionally, and that he'll spend the rest of his life trying to make sense of how he convinced himself that hurting kids were helping them. The last page is directly to Seymour, though he knows Seymour might never read it. He apologizes for making him feel broken, for treating his cerebral palsy like something that needed to be fixed through fear and pain. He says Seymour was never broken, that he was a brave kid who deserved a coach who built him up instead of tearing him down. It's more accountability than most abusers ever offer, and while it doesn't fix anything or change what happened, I fold it carefully and put it in a file with Seymour's other important documents. Maybe he'll want to read it someday. Maybe he won't. But at least it'll be there if he needs it. Baker calls a few days later saying the settlement is finalized and ready for signatures. We meet at his office and he walks me through the paperwork, explaining how the trust fund works. The money is set up so Seymour can access it for education, medical needs, and therapy for as long as he needs it. There are provisions for ongoing mental health care, physical therapy if his cerebral palsy requires it, and educational support if he needs accommodations in the school. Baker made sure the fund is structured so it can grow over time, giving Seymour resources well into adulthood. The money can't undo the trauma or give back the months of fear, but it means Seymour will have support to heal and succeed, no matter what he needs. I sign the papers and Baker shakes my hand, telling me I did good by my son even when everything was falling apart. On the way home, I stop by the school district office to pick up a copy of their new safety protocols. The woman at the desk hands me a thick binder, explaining that all coaches now have to complete abuse prevention training. Athletes have access to anonymous reporting systems, and kids in high-pressure sports programs get mandatory mental health screenings twice a year. She mentions casually that the principal who was at Seymour's school got transferred to a district office job handling paperwork and facilities management. It's not justice, not really, but at least she's not making decisions about kids' safety anymore. I flip through the binder in my car and see sections on recognizing coaching abuse, supporting athletes with disabilities, and creating safe team environments. It won't protect every kid, but it might help some, and that's better than nothing. Seymour finishes his second season with the Recreational Swim League in May, and the team has an end-of-year party at a local pizza place. Every kid gets a medal just for participating, no rankings or winners, just recognition that they showed up and tried. Seymour clutches his medal the whole drive home, running his thumb over the raised letters. That night, I find it on his nightstand next to his bed, carefully positioned where he can see it first thing in the morning. I stand in his doorway watching him sleep and realize this is what success actually looks like when adults prioritize kids' well-being over winning. Not state championships or college scholarships, but a 7-year-old who loves swimming again and sleeps peacefully with a participation medal next to his pillow. In June, Ray and I take Seymour camping for a long weekend, just the 3 of us. We drive up to a state park 3 hours away and spend the days hiking easy trails that Seymour can manage with his cerebral palsy. At night, we build a fire and roast marshmallows and tell stories. On the second night, Seymour asks Ray what prison was like. Ray looks at me and I nod, trusting him to handle it right. Ray tells Seymour it was hard and boring and lonely, but that sometimes doing the right thing costs you something, and that doesn't make it wrong. He explains that he'd make the same choice again because protecting people you love matters more than staying comfortable. Seymour nods slowly, processing this in that serious way kids do when they're thinking about big ideas. Then he asks if Ray was scared, and Ray says yes, every day. But being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs doing even when you're terrified. Seymour seems satisfied with this answer and goes back to poking the fire with a stick. Later, after Seymour falls asleep in the tent, Ray and I sit by the dying fire and don't talk, just exist together as brothers who did something terrible and necessary and are still figuring out how to live with it. 2 years after everything started, Seymour's therapist calls me in for a meeting without him. She tells me Seymour is processing the trauma in healthy ways, using the coping skills she taught him, and doesn't need weekly sessions anymore. She's moving him to monthly check-ins just to make sure he stays on track, but she's confident in his progress. She says I did a good job getting him help even when everything else was chaos, and that early intervention probably prevented worse long-term damage. Seymour is proud when I tell him about moving to monthly sessions, seeing it as proof that he's getting better. That night, he tells me he barely has nightmares anymore, maybe once a month instead of every night, and when he does have them, he can usually calm himself down. His hair is fully grown back, thick and healthy, and he doesn't flinch when people touch his head anymore. I run into Hans at the grocery store on a random Tuesday afternoon. We both freeze in the produce section, neither sure if we should acknowledge each other. Finally, he walks over, and we have an awkward conversation about how everything turned out. He tells me the aquatic center has new management, and they completely overhauled their coaching oversight, with multiple staff members observing practices and regular check-ins with athletes. He still feels guilty about not speaking up sooner, about all those months he saw things that bothered him, but told himself it wasn't his business. I tell him that he helped when it mattered most, that his cooperation and the camera footage made the difference between Retisha getting away with it and facing consequences. Hans nods, but I can tell he's still carrying the weight of his silence. Sometimes that has to be enough, learning to live with the mistakes we made while trying to do better going forward. On a quiet Tuesday night a few months later, I'm helping Seymour with his math homework at the kitchen table. He's working on multiplication and getting frustrated with the problems, erasing and rewriting the same equation. I'm about to suggest taking a break when he puts down his pencil and looks at me. He says he's glad I protected him even though it was scary, and that he feels safe now. I feel my throat get tight and pull him into a hug, telling him he deserves to feel safe always, that keeping him safe is the most important thing I'll ever do. He hugs me back hard, then pulls away and goes back to his math like it's no big deal. I watch him work through the problems, his hair falling across his forehead as he concentrates, his smile genuine when he gets an answer right. Despite all the mistakes I made and the costs we paid, my son is healing. He feels safe. He's rediscovering joy in swimming and learning to trust adults again. That's what matters most. That's where we'll close things for today. I'm honestly so glad you were here. Sharing these stories with you always feels special. I hope this one left your heart a little lighter. Subscribe if you'd like to come back for the next good story.